I'm going to rank every single boss from Super Paper Mario. Let me explain. Aside from this game being known for going in a completely different direction from what the series originally was, this game is known for how great of a story it contains. It's emotional, it's deep, it has character development that makes sense. Overall, it's a great story. But one thing that this game is absolutely not known for are the bosses, and truly for a good reason. When switching to a platformer instead of a turn-based battle system, it was a change that the quality of bosses, at least to me, were not adapted to. So on to the rules. Aside from this list being my opinion, of course, the only rule to point out is what bosses didn't make it on here. There's only a couple that won't be included, and it's mainly the optional bosses. Those being Racktail, Shadow, and the level 100 boss for Sammer's Kingdom. I also will include the optional Francis fight at 8-2. Other than that though, I think the rules are pretty clear, so let's not hold off anymore or get right into it. What in the world is this boss fight? I don't know what this boss fight is trying to accomplish, because I feel like nothing would ever work with what this boss fight has going for it. This boss fight has you breathing fire with Bowser onto tentacles with red suction cups. He will send up blue tentacles, which if you do damage to, they will do nothing. There are so many problems with this concept though, and first being that Big Blooper never attacks you. While the Big Blooper thrusts his tentacles into the air, which could be considered an attack, it's so astronomically slow that you can look away for a couple of seconds and still get out of the way. Easy bosses are a common theme in this game, but here it's kinda insultingly easy, especially since this isn't even one of the first bosses in this game. It's really just a waiting game that has nothing going on because he doesn't attack you. I guess it could be looked at as a good use of Bowser since the boss has you breathing fire as a way to damage the red tentacles. It also does have a somewhat intimidating presence, which could be nice for a first playthrough, but overall this boss fight is just not enjoyable. Everything about it, or more so what this boss fight lacks, makes it a complete slog to get through. I get that this could be considered a mini boss and it should be simple because of that, but this boss fight feels more brain dead than the first Chunks fight, which is just sad. It's so weird that I used to think of this boss fight as fine before, and I mainly thought this because it was a unique character compared to complex minions. I guess I was overlooking the true quality of this fight, and it shows for this fight landing at the bottom at number 21. The next few fights are ones that I am able to cheese super easily. Now these fights are pretty difficult to rank because me cheesing them completely ruins what the boss fight has going for it, since I kill them before anything truly happens. With this in mind though, I think how heavily my opinion will be dampened by the cheese is by how easy it is to find and pull off. If you have to do a difficult task to cheese a fight, it doesn't seem fair to hold it against the fight itself. A good example of this is with Fractail, and being able to jump to his body after being done with each phase. But that's a different fight, and we gotta talk about the second Mimi fight. Why is this fight the worst out of the cheese boss fights? To simply put it, you can kill Mimi in less than 5 seconds, and I found this out by accident. If you were high enough level, which might I add is not high level, just going through killing enemies casually with zero grinding, you can just breathe fire with Bowser, and if she is hit twice, then she will die. Like I said, I found this out by accident and I was super confused and just moved on. My only opinions with this fight are just by watching playthroughs of the boss fight because I don't have a normal experience with it unlike the others. The fight is decent enough though. She goes into 3D, which makes it much harder to hit her. She sends rubies at you, which can be a dangerous attack, and overall it would land at least in the top 15. Even then though, it's not perfect. I feel like the boss fight is more basic than the first Mimi fight since she doesn't feel as original. The only different thing with this fight, aside from her not being a spider, is her going into 3D like I mentioned before. It also just feels pretty boring since the fight has zero concept, especially because you are in the world where you fight enemies the entire time. It kinda just feels like another stage, and because of this, it deserves to be at number 20. Man, Ochunks is a character with some very interesting boss fights. God, even that's a lie. Ochunks is the character you fight the most in this game, and they all consist of the same thing. He jumps around and can grab you if you get too close. It's boring, it's generic, it was the first boss you fought for a reason. But the first fight isn't the worst Ochunks fight? Well, the second fight is just pathetic to me. Does he do more attacks? Maybe. Do I care? Absolutely not. This fight does literally nothing to change the original fight in difficulty. In fact, it's actually easier. Having characters like Bowser make the fight a cakewalk, and it takes absolutely no skill to beat the fight because of it. And here's the kicker. This is in Chapter 5. The first fight was in Chapter 1, but this is all the way at the mid-game. There isn't that much to this fight to talk about. It's easily defeated, and it doesn't do anything to improve, which is why it gets number 19. Ochunks number 3 is a fight that exists. Weirdly so it exists. Both the second and third fight are in Chapter 5, which felt strange, but I'd rather do this fight than the other. It's faster, or at least it feels faster. I think that's really the only thing that the plant does, or maybe it's legit just nothing. Placebo or not, it feels faster paced. And that's really it. It's the same exact Ochunks fight, and you have even more options on how to cheese him. You could use Bowser or Kudge with any of the characters. He probably has new attacks, but they felt so unnoticeable since I don't even remember them. It's another easy fight that can get cheesed, so because of this, it should be at number 18. And we finally made it to the first boss in the game. Is there really anything else to add? It's just an Ochunks fight, but in its basic form. It's boring, slow, dull, and it lacks a concept to be memorable. It is more difficult, at least compared to the two Ochunks fight that come after this one, and it's mainly because you only have Mario and Throw. Now, using Throw on this boss fight still makes it a joke, but it's definitely not as easy compared to the fights below this. And it's the first boss at the end of the day. A basic boss like this was never really gonna rank high, so being at number 17 is a godsend. I've always been conflicted on the first Bowser fight. On one hand, I think it's better than other mini-bosses in this game, but also worse in a couple of ways. I'll talk about why it's worse first. I've always found it annoying that it's super obscure on how to defeat this boss. You use Boomer, which is fine, but before I've always found it so weirdly cryptic. There also is nothing else with this boss fight aside from figuring out this concept, which is a bit disappointing. His attacks are okay enough, I guess. He jumps around and breathes fire, but that's about it. It's very realistic because these are the moves you can do as Bowser after the battle when he joins your party, but it makes the boss fight worse overall. I will say that this boss fight is kind of difficult, which is nice and probably the best part about it. Timing Boomer to blow up at the right time isn't difficult, but it isn't the easiest thing in the world. I also like that he can't get jumped on. If he did, then he would be an Ochunks clone, which is just boring. Yeah, really thinking about it, this is just Ochunks with a spike on his head and a little bit more range with his attacks. It's barely better, but barely better means you land higher on the list, so it lands at number 16. I don't know what else to say anymore. It's the final appearance of Ochunks, so I want to make this quick. The reason why this boss fight is the highest is for a very simple reason. He grows pretty big. This does a couple of things. One thing it does is it makes it harder to hit him. You have to jump way higher than normal to land attacks. He also has more threatening attacks because of this. There is still a problem though. You are forced to use Bowser in this fight, and of course you will demolish him with your fire. And even not your fire, you got Kudge, Carry, Boomer, anything under the sun to completely make a joke out of Ochunks. And that is what Ochunks truly is, a joke. And that's why he lands at number 15. This is the very first chapter boss that we are talking about on this list. Chapter bosses are normally much better than mini bosses because they are intentionally built up to be better. They have more focus put into them. Well, at least for the most part. I see what they were trying to do with Bone Chill. You got Luigi in this world, so you should use him for this fight. And I think this fight has a good use of Luigi. Slamming his head into Bone Chill's skull to do damage or use it to float on top of his head. I also think his attacks are slightly underrated. While they are easy to dodge, they at the very least cover almost the entire room, which can be threatening. But yeah, back to being able to stay on top of his head. Here are the problems. The cheese for this fight isn't actually that detrimental to the quality. While it can be found, it's not as easy as the second Mimi fight. Even without the cheese though, this fight is still astronomically easy for how late it is into the game. And because it doesn't do anything interesting besides attacking, it is a very unmemorable and disappointing late game boss fight. I also think the music for this fight is super forgettable. It feels so generic and it doesn't feel like any personality comes out from this music in the slightest. It's just generic fight music. Almost everything here fails, which is just sad, and it definitely deserves to be number 14. This is a weird boss fight to talk about because it's just so different compared to the other bosses for very obvious reasons. This is a turn-based combat system, but you don't dodge or do anything while the opponent attacks. And now I'm glad that this game is a platformer. This battle system, to me personally, is boring. You select something and that's all that happens. You don't do anything else and it's just boring. I get that this can be nostalgic for some people, but I grew up with the Wii to begin with. I have zero nostalgia for this battle system. I will say that I like how many options you truly have in this boss fight. The absolute best part is just experimenting with every single pixel and seeing what they do. Some are obvious, like Boomer and Kudge, but what would pixels like Fleep and Slim do? I still don't remember what they do, and I appreciate that. But that doesn't change how dragged out the battle itself feels. It may be cool to experiment with every pixel and character ability, but everything just takes so painfully long. You have to take out 3 chain chomps instead of 1, and after the second one, it's just not fun anymore, and I want it to end. This boss is way more of a cool concept than a good boss, which is why it lands at number 13. We have now reached something I'd like to call the gray zone. This is the place for boss fights that exist. They're there. They are extremely basic, but the fight itself is completely fine. It's just not interesting to talk about. And the first to represent these fights is the second Bowser fight. This fight, the one where Bowser thinks you secretly have Peach, but you actually don't, but he fights you anyway. It's generic. He jumps around, he breathes fire, it's basically the same as the first Bowser fight at chapter 3. This one is much higher though because of Kudge. Normally Kudge is used as an overpowered attack to demolish most bosses. Here though, it's used as your only attack. I guess you could use Carry as well, but Kudge is still the best in this case. He also is pretty tanky, which is appreciated since you are using Kudge. That's it though. It's still a basic boss fight that is slightly more tanky than normal, which is why it lands at number 12. So weirdly, this is the only fight in chapter 2, and I think the lack of bosses might make this boss fight seem better on a playthrough of the game because of it. But when looking at the boss fight itself compared to the others, I mean, it's not bad. I like that it has a set amount of health. You have to jump on her body once and then again to remove one of her legs. I wish that this concept of set health was used later in the game, cause here it isn't as appreciated. Every time that one of her legs is removed, Mimi gets faster and faster until she is almost lightning speed. It seems like the boss fight would be amazingly fast paced because of it, and the way I'm talking about it makes it seem like that logic is perfect, but there's a problem. This fight is another one that can be cheesed, but not in terms of cheating the game. If you know what you're doing, then defeating this boss fight before it even attacks you is a cakewalk. It's very easy for an experienced player to just jump on Mimi and easily jump on her after. And when I say experienced, I mean played the game once or twice, not a pro. Because of this, it's just very difficult to have a genuinely fun time, which is why it lands at number 11. Another basic boss fight, but the second fight is worse than the original. Now these two Dementio fights are the exact same. He splits into different copies and shoots magic sparkles at you. It's really hard to determine the real Dementio when he splits into different copies, which is the best part of the fight. They also shoot magic sparkles at you, which means there will be around 9 at once, which is pretty difficult to dodge. He only attacks with those projectiles though, and it's just basic because of it. He does go into 3D, which is good for the fight because he becomes invulnerable. But this leads into why this fight is worse than the original. You are forced to use Luigi, and Luigi's high jump completely demolishes Dementio here. It's disappointing because I actually think this fight is easier than the original one. And I get that they were mainly focusing on the dimensional chase that was right before the fight, but that's not what I'm focusing on here. While that chase is great, this fight is not at that same quality, which is why it's number 10. So the fight that I just talked about? Yeah, so put it in this random green room and you don't have Luigi. Now Bowser's Flames could be used, but they aren't that effective. Because of this, you have to fight Dementio legitimately. Still a basic boss because it doesn't have that many interesting attacks, but at least I won't demolish it in 2 seconds. And maybe that's all a boss fight needs. While this is a basic boss fight, I wouldn't say I disliked it or even thought it was meh. It was a fine, almost decent fight that is just kind of unmemorable. It's sad to say, but this is the second best mini-boss in the game, which while is a bit disappointing for the quality of mini-bosses, at least we're gonna get into more interesting bosses after this one. While Brobot L-Type may look really cool, this fight couldn't be more generic than ever. It's so weird that a fight like this can land so high on the list, but it shows the quality of the bosses we have in Super Paper Mario. This fight is basic. How do you damage him? Boomer. The exact same way you damage the first Bowser fight. Now he can try to suck you into his robot, which is a place where you can use Boomer, and that way to damage him is unique and the way I like. The problem is that the other way is just placing Boomer down and timing his explosion. We did this before in the Bowser fight. It sucks too because this one problem completely kills the fight's quality. And this boss fight has good attacks. I like him flying in the air trying to squish you. I like his suction attack that I mentioned before. I like that he shoots his hands at you. I like that he shoots his mustache at you like a boomerang. His attacks are pretty solid overall. It's just so disappointing that the way to kill him is so basic, and the overall concept of this fight has nothing unique. There clearly is potential with this fight, but nothing was stretched out to even try anything. I guess another reason why there is more disappointment too is because of the original Brobot fight being better than this one. They are two polar opposite fights, and the only similarity is that the robots are similar. I truly wish it was better, but this is what we are left with, which is why it's number 8. This is the final mini boss on the list, and with that logic, this is the best one, and it's definitely a good fight. One thing that I really appreciate is that it is basically impossible to cheese unlike the first one. Is it possible for you to take no damage with the fight easily without skill? Yes. Because you were forced to use Peach, you can easily hide under her umbrella and not take a single hit of damage. Now defense cheeses I legitimately don't care about. While it makes the fight easier, it doesn't make the fight take a shorter amount of time. With this cheese, it actually makes the fight technically longer. Mimi's attacks are decent enough too. While they are just an upgraded version of her attacks from the first one in chapter 2, I never thought those attacks were bad. She also gets some new ones that are not super easy to dodge. Her health is the same as the chapter 2 fight, but the fight takes place in a black room. When her legs fall off, you can't actually see where the legs fall, and it's harder to keep track of her health because of it. She also gets faster every time one of her legs falls off, just like the first fight, and I'm glad it came back. Overall, it's a solid fight. While I think the fight is pretty generic and unmemorable compared to the fights above it, for a mini boss, this is the best the game can offer, which is why it's number 7. Francis is a unique character in this game, and his boss fight definitely reflects this. His attacks are so strange to see. He sends cat bombs at you that can explode. He can eat you, and you have to shake the Wii remote to get out of his stomach. And he can even take a picture which blinds the entire screen. This is way more unique than just the boss jumps. The boss has projectile. No, this boss fight has genuinely fun and unique attacks. It's also paired with him going invisible for every time he isn't attacking you. This does two things. One is that obviously it makes it much more difficult to hit him, which is always a plus. But the other thing is that it's basically impossible to cheese him. There is not a single tactic in this game that you could use to defeat Francis easily, which I think is a big positive. Definitely something that shot him up on the list for sure. Sadly, to me personally, I've always found this boss fight kind of basic and boring, and I don't even completely know why. It could be all the waiting you have to do when he is invisible, but that doesn't seem too bad. I guess the music is pretty generic, which could add to it, since the music for most chapter bosses are pretty memorable, where this one just kind of exists. I'd still say this boss fight is good, but sadly it's just not a boss fight that sticks out in my head, which is why it lands at number 6. Now, for the people who say that I have a bias against first bosses, well, you'd be right. But first bosses still can be awesome, and Fractale is easily one of the best examples. I can't believe how different this fight actually is. It's easily the second most unique fight in the game. You literally have to jump on the dragon and throw these mouse things on his antenna to damage him. So it's even a good use of throw. Now, one thing that people may say, and I get the logic behind when saying it, what about the cheese where you jump from his tail back to his head? There are 3 reasons why this cheese is so much different from other ones. One reason is that this cheese is actually really difficult. You have to time your jump pretty accurately, as well as you having to get some momentum and some pretty perfect positioning to land the jump. The second thing is that this doesn't make the fight end immediately compared to some cheeses like the second Mimi fight and the second Ochunks fight. And lastly, the cheese is genuinely fun. Having to time it perfectly is just really satisfying to pull off, as well as the positioning needed is just really difficult. I feel like at least half of the people who know about it attempt it at least once throughout the fight. It's just really fun to try and pull off. Now, this fight isn't perfect. I think one big problem is that before you start riding the dragon for each phase, it's pretty boring. You have to dodge a single attack, which is not even a challenge since even if you're moving a little bit, you'll dodge his jaw. And the only other thing is legit just you turning into 3D and jumping on his back. That's it, in a 30-second period. This makes the fight just not good enough to be any higher on the list. But for a first fight, it is astronomical that it landed in the top 5. The pseudo-final boss. Count Bleck is simple, but his attacks are pretty solid. He uses the Void, he slows you down, he rushes towards you. Again, simple, but pretty decent. He has a lot of health, which is something I can't say about most of the bosses we've talked about so far. He also isn't that easy to deal damage to. The landscape you are on to defeat Count Bleck is massive, so it's really difficult to figure out where he is. He teleports every single time you hit him, so you won't know exactly where he is the majority of the fight. The platforms you are on as well makes it very difficult to land a hit on him, since you can easily just jump on the one above him or just completely miss, which is a big positive. While yes, you can use Bowser's Flames to get around this, it isn't a cheese to the fight unlike many others. The music for this fight is also great. I feel like the music overall is a tad bit overrated for this game, where it does have some great pieces, it just doesn't have an amazingly memorable soundtrack throughout. This boss's theme, on the other hand, is amazing. It's pretty intense and super catchy. Now I have to say that this boss fight is pretty basic. While he does do a decent amount of damage each attack and debuffs you way more than other fights, it's still just jump on him and you win. And even if we are saying that the attacks are great for this fight, I still think they are a bit basic. This is a fun fight, no doubt, but I do think that there are some fights that are just slightly more interesting than this one, which makes it land outside the top 3. Now this boss fight is where it's at. It has so many things going for it and almost everything about it works beautifully. I guess let's start with the music, and my gosh, the music is incredible. Not only the boss theme, but the music before it. It genuinely makes the boss fight feel more intimidating than it actually is, which is a huge positive. It's just a spiky flower, but it feels intense. Now let's talk about the fight itself, and it's split into 2 phases. The first phase is where King Crocus is locked on the floor with his 3 other small flowers. You have to either jump on the flowers to jump on King Crocus himself, or use throw on the small flowers to throw them on the king. If you try to jump on the king from the flowers, my gosh, it is difficult, but way more fun. I think the absolute best part about this fight is that King Crocus actually blocks his weak point. This is one of the only bosses that does this on the list, and it makes damage combos impossible, as well as just makes the boss fight way more difficult. This especially applies when trying to jump on him when on the flowers, because he opens and closes periodically in a way that is really difficult to time. Now all of this is great, but that's only the first phase. The second phase, on the other hand, okay, well, it's not bad. It's just more a worse version of what Francis was trying to do. You just wait until he opens up and you jump on him. He does send some petal saw blades towards you, but they are pretty tiny and not super fast. Because of this, they aren't a threat. But who cares about the second phase when the first phase is so good? I will say that if you use throw in the first phase, maybe this fight shouldn't be in the top 3. It becomes a fight that, while still isn't easy, it's much easier to get through the first phase. I think it would go right below Fractale in that case. But for how I personally do the fight, this is some of the absolute best that Super Paper Mario offers, which is why it's number 3. For those wondering, this counts both Mr. L and Brobot in one segment. And oh boy, this boss sure is different. I'm just gonna get the first phase out of the way because just like the second phase of King Crocus, it's nothing that special. Heck, I actually think it's worse than that phase because it's extremely simple. It's just Luigi's ability to high jump constantly throughout the battle. Now this isn't a bad fight though. While that attack is extremely simple, it's pretty annoying for me personally to dodge when trying to hit him. He can also heal during the fight, and while it does take a decent amount of time to pull off, it's something that adds to the fight. Okay, but that's not actually what put this fight at number 2. It's finally time we talk about Brobot itself, and my gosh, is the fight interesting. You are in space and you have Squirps to shoot down Brobot. There are a ton of candy bars to give you power-ups like a barrier, increased power, double shooting, and so much more. You are constantly trying to shoot and move around his attacks, which is just a blast. While the controls in space are a bit janky, I think it helps make the fight last a bit longer since he doesn't have a lot of health. And speaking of his health, well, I think I need to get out of the way that this used to be my favorite boss in the game. Well, not anymore. This boss I already knew was a joke coming into it, but for me personally, I didn't mind that before. Now I do, and here's why. Obviously the power-ups make this fight super easy, but they always added to the quality still. So it wasn't those. 200 HP is actually a lot of HP, but you can demolish it pretty easily. But again, I didn't mind that before. So what was it? Well, it was his attacks this time around. They're not only pretty easy to dodge, but they are so infrequent in my opinion that it felt like he was just doing nothing for most of the battle. While they are generic, I never found them bad before. It's just a lot of lasers and suction like Robot L-type. But I guess the lack of him pulling them off really disappointed me. It's still one of the best fights and one of the best moments in this game, but sadly that one quality has knocked it down from gold to silver. Wow, the final boss is number 1. I would say what a surprise, but last time I didn't have Super Dementio in the top spot, so I guess it is a bit of a surprise. Super Dementio is the final boss of this game, and it has all the features that makes one great. The music of this boss fight is amazing. It doesn't really feel like final boss music, but it weirdly still fits the fight. And of course it sounds amazing. His attacks are, well, surprisingly subpar. He can jump in the air and land on you, he can throw punches, and he can probably do other things that I'm not remembering from the top of my head. This makes the boss fight seem boring, but it does something way better. Super Dementio messes with the battlefield. Instead of with the Count Bleck fight where it has non-moving small platforms, this one has those same platforms, but they move side to side very unpredictably. And they have a creepy face. These faces also provide what the attacks in this fight were lacking: fast pace. Once you knock down Super Dementio's health a bit, these platforms will start spamming the screen with small squares that will damage you. There are way more than I remember, and it made the fight surprisingly difficult. You have to jump on these platforms that are literally attacking you and moving weirdly to jump on the boss itself. He has a decent amount of health like Count Bleck, so it's not a pushover either. Now the only thing I don't like is that you can damage the boss by jumping on his body. The two ways to damage him are jumping on his head and his body. Jumping on his head really should be the only way to damage him, since while jumping on his body does less damage, it's a much easier option since it's lower to the ground and it's much bigger. I know there will be an argument out there that Bowser makes this fight much easier, and to that I say, you are absolutely right. Using Bowser's Flames or just using Bowser to jump on Super Dementio makes the fight significantly easier, but this applies to almost every single boss in this game as well, so for me it isn't a complaint. Is this final boss perfect? Absolutely not. Again, I wish that you couldn't damage him from his body, and also it would be cool to get more attacks from Super Dementio itself. But what we have here overall is just a genuinely fun fight that is a great way to end the game. These bosses are just not as fun as I imagined they would be. While I knew coming into this game that Super Mario is not known for its bosses, what came out of the game was in reality only a single digit amount of good bosses, and only a handful of them that will be memorable. It's disappointing, but this is what the game became. Before I get to the outro stuff, I do have an announcement. I'm going to start speedrunning Super Paper Mario on Twitch. I plan on streaming the game hopefully soon enough after the video comes out, but it might not be for a little bit. Go in the description to follow my Twitch page for the first run, and I'll see you guys there. Thank you guys for watching this video. If you lasted this long, I'd really appreciate if you guys liked the video and subscribed. I also have a podcast called The Flatmates that will be on the screen and in the description below, so check those out. But other than that, G-bye.